At 2:14 on a Wednesday afternoon, the pen was 1 inch above the signature line on a $500,000 expansion loan for my family's hardware store. Then the bakery owner next door called me 3 times in a row. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. "Bradley," Michelle whispered, "why are there movers carrying boxes out of your store?" My hand went still. "What kind of boxes?" Her answer turned the bank office silent. "They just loaded your business license, the old iron deed box, and the red ledger into a rented truck." I set the pen down. I did not shout. I did not run for the door. Panic is how fraudsters make you miss the paperwork. I looked across the desk at the loan officer and asked one question. "Linda, did anyone file a new partnership agreement under my store's name in the last 48 hours? Her face changed before she answered. "Yes, Bradley. A revised corporate structure was submitted this morning. It lists you as a minority shareholder. That was when I knew this was not a burglary. Burglars steal tools. Fraudsters steal ownership. And whoever had just tried to steal my grandfather's store had forgotten one thing. Before I came home to run Stevens Hardware, I spent 30 years proving fraud for a living. I drove back to Stevens Hardware in complete absolute silence. I did not speed. I did not run red lights. I let my mind systematically categorize the variables of the crime scene I was about to enter. When I pulled my truck into the back alley behind the store, the rented moving truck was gone. The heavy steel security door, which required a complex alphanumeric passcode to open, was pulled shut, but not fully latched. I pushed the door open and walked into the back office. The silence inside the room was heavy and violating. The heavy steel filing cabinets that lined the back wall, cabinets that held decades of tax returns, vendor contracts, and employment records, had been systematically emptied. The framed original business license from 1934, which had hung proudly above my father's old wooden desk for my entire life, was gone, leaving a clean, rectangular shadow on the dusty wallpaper. But it was the absence of the heavy, fireproof safe that hit me the hardest. The safe had been cracked. Not blown open, not drilled, but opened using the old 6-digit combination that only 3 people in the world knew. Inside that safe was the heavy iron deed box containing the original property title. And sitting right next to it, the most important object in the entire building, was the red ledger. The red ledger was not a financial document. It was a thick, leather-bound accounting book that my grandfather had started using the day he opened the doors. It was filled with faded ink, detailing the names of local farmers and tradesmen who had been given tools on credit during the Great Depression, people who had nowhere else to turn. It contained the handwritten amendments of our ownership, the signature of my father the day he took over, and a single page at the very end, written by my father shortly before his death. "Bradley stays," the note read, in his sharp, slanted handwriting. "Because Bradley understands what this place is." The red ledger was the last thing my father asked to see before he died. He did not ask about the bank balance. He did not ask about the property value. He asked whether the ledger was still on the shelf. The red ledger was not where we kept money. It was where my grandfather kept promises. Whoever had taken it understood the psychological weight of that book. They knew that taking the ledger was the equivalent of taking the soul of the business. They thought that by holding the physical history of Stevens Hardware, they would somehow legitimize their theft. They believed that history lived entirely on paper. I looked up at the corner of the ceiling. The small, discreet digital security camera I had installed 3 years ago was covered with a perfectly cut square of black electrical tape. I stood in the center of the empty office, smelling the familiar scent of sawdust, old paper, and machine oil. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger wash over me, and then letting it drain away, leaving nothing but cold, clinical focus. Thieves steal things. Fraudsters steal the story first. I already knew who had done this. I did not need a confession, and I did not need to run fingerprints. The list of suspects was a list of one. Her name was Emily Stevens. She was my younger sister. Emily was 46 years old, 12 years my junior. Growing up, she had always hated the hardware store, while I spent my weekends sweeping the floors, learning the difference between galvanized and stainless steel screws, and watching my father treat every customer like family. Emily had complained about the smell. She had called the store a museum that smells like sawdust and old men. She could not wait to leave Grand Island. She moved to the city, chased a series of glamorous, high-paying jobs that never seemed to last, and married a man named Trevor Walsh. Trevor was a financial consultant, or at least, that was the title printed on his expensive business cards. He was a man who spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords, wearing tailored suits and constantly talking about maximizing assets and liquidating stagnant equity. He was exactly the kind of man Emily felt she deserved. But a few years ago, when Trevor's consulting business started hemorrhaging money, Emily and Trevor suddenly returned to Grand Island. They moved into a large house in a gated community, living far beyond their means, and suddenly, Emily developed an intense, highly unnatural interest in Stevens hardware. She began asking probing questions about our annual revenue. She demanded to see the books, claiming she had a right to know the financial health of the family legacy. She wanted to know how much the prime downtown real estate the store sat on was worth. I never denied her money when she was truly in need, but I absolutely refused to give her operational control. I knew that Trevor looked at the store and saw nothing but real estate to be sold, inventory to be liquidated, and a cash grab to fund their failing lifestyle. For months, Emily had been quietly building a narrative. She had been planting seeds of doubt among our extended family, subtly suggesting that I was becoming too old, too tired, and too set in my ways to run the business effectively. She weaponized my grief over losing my wife, whispering to my cousins that I was emotionally unstable and dragging the store down with me. She resented the fact that our father had trusted me with the keys, while never trusting her with the register. She believed that because she was a Stevens, she was automatically entitled to half of everything, regardless of the fact that she had never worked a single day on the floor. People always ask why intelligent people fall victim to family fraud. The answer is incredibly simple. When a stranger breaks into your house, you call the police. When a sibling breaks into your life, you try to find a reason to forgive them. You try to remember the child you grew up with, instead of the predator they have become. But I had spent 30 years looking at predators. I walked over to the desk, pulled a pair of latex gloves from my pocket, and carefully removed the black electrical tape from the camera lens. Emily had covered the camera, assuming it recorded locally to a hard drive in the office. She forgot that I had spent my entire career dealing with people who tried to destroy evidence. The camera did not record to a hard drive. It uploaded a secure, encrypted feed directly to a cloud server I maintained personally. I pulled out my phone, opened the security application, and scrubbed back to 1:12 p.m. The video loaded instantly in crisp, high-definition clarity. There was my sister, Emily, wearing a trench coat and sunglasses, standing nervously in the center of the office. And right beside her was her husband, Trevor, wearing a pair of leather gloves, methodically punching my father's old combination into the heavy steel safe. I watched as Trevor pulled the red ledger out of the safe. I watched as he handed it to Emily. I watched as she held it in her hands, looking at it not with reverence, but with the cold, calculating greed of a woman holding a winning lottery ticket. I hit pause on the video, staring at the frozen image of my own sister, robbing our family blind. Most brothers would have called the police right then. Most men would have driven to her gated community, kicked the door open, and demanded the ledger back. But I am not most men. I am a fraud investigator, and I knew that calling the police now would only lead to a messy, complicated civil dispute. Emily would claim she had the right to the documents. Trevor would produce his forged partnership agreement. The police would call it a family matter, and the store would be locked in probate hell for years while the legal bills piled up. I did not want a civil dispute. I wanted an absolute, undeniable, public execution of their lies. I locked the office door, sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to follow the paper trail. It was time to find out exactly how deep the rot went, and then it was time to build a trap they would never see coming. The beautiful thing about a digital paper trail is that it lacks the emotional capacity to lie. People lie. Relatives lie. Siblings who feel entitled to an inheritance they never earned lie with a particularly convincing brand of righteous indignation. But timestamps, IP addresses, and routing numbers are entirely indifferent to family politics. They only tell the truth. I did not immediately drive to Emily's gated community. I did not call her phone. I did not send an angry text message. If you want to catch a fraudster, you do not let them know that you have realized a crime has been committed. You let them believe they are the smartest people in the room, right until the moment you lock the door behind them. I sat alone in the quiet, dusty office of Stevens Hardware, the empty rectangular shadow on the wall, serving as a constant reminder of exactly what had been stolen from me. I opened my laptop, connected to my secure network, and began the forensic reconstruction of my own murder. In the world of corporate fraud, theft is rarely a single impulsive act. It is a slow, methodical process of administrative restructuring. You cannot simply walk into a bank, claim you own a deeply established local business, and ask for a loan. You have to build a bridge of legitimate-looking documents that can withstand a cursory glance from a busy loan officer. I logged into the State Business Registry portal. As the legal owner of Stevens Hardware, I still had access to the master administrative account, a detail Trevor had apparently overlooked in his rush to liquidate my legacy. I pulled the most recent filings associated with our corporate identification number. There were 3 new documents, all submitted within the last 48 hours. I opened the first file. It was an amendment of corporate structure. My eyes scanned the heavy legal text. According to the document, which had been filed under penalty of perjury, Stevens Hardware was no longer a sole proprietorship. It had been restructured into a limited liability partnership. I scrolled down to the equity distribution table. Emily Stevens Walsh, 60% controlling interest. Bradley Stevens, 40% non-voting interest. The audacity was breathtaking. They had not just stolen money. They had legally rewritten the history of the store. With a 60% controlling interest, Emily had the legal authority to liquidate inventory, sell the real estate, terminate employees, and cancel the expansion loan I had spent 6 months negotiating. She had the power to entirely erase my grandfather's name from the town. I scrolled to the bottom of the final page, focusing on the signature line. There it was. My signature, Bradley Arthur Stevens. To the untrained eye, it looked perfect. It had the same sharp, aggressive B, the same slight slant to the right on the S. If Linda Cho had glanced at it quickly, she would have assumed I had signed it myself. But I am not an untrained eye. When you spend 30 years authenticating documents for federal insurance claims, you learn that forging a signature is not about replicating the shape of the letters. It is about replicating the speed. A person signing their own name does it with absolute, thoughtless fluidity. The ink flows heavily at the start and tapers off at the end of the stroke because the hand is moving fast. A forger is drawing, not signing. They hesitate. They slow down on the complex curves. I zoomed in on the digital document until the ink strokes filled the screen. Right there, at the bottom curve of the Y in Bradley, the ink line thickened slightly. It was a micro-hesitation. Whoever had signed this, and I knew it was Trevor, whose hands had always been too soft for actual labor, had paused for a fraction of a second to ensure the loop matched my historical signature. It was a forgery, and it was a sloppy one. But a forged signature is useless unless it is notarized. I looked at the official state notary stamp pressed onto the bottom right corner of the document. The blue ink was clear and perfectly legible. Notarized by Paul Griggs. I leaned back in my father's old wooden chair, letting out a slow, deeply tired sigh. Paul Griggs. Paul was a local notary public who operated out of a small, cluttered office above a dry cleaner 3 blocks away from the hardware store. He was a man who had built a quiet reputation in Grand Island for being incredibly flexible with his professional ethics. If you needed a document notarized quickly, and you didn't have all the required parties present, Paul would happily stamp it for you, provided you paid him a $300 convenience fee in cash. Trevor had not chosen a random notary. He had chosen a man who was perfectly willing to look the other way while a family business was stolen out from under its rightful owner. Paul Griggs had just stamped his name onto a federal felony. He had verified that I was physically present in his office to sign a document surrendering 60% of my business. I checked the timestamp on the notary seal. It was dated for the previous Tuesday at 10:15 a.m. I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar. Last Tuesday at 10:15 a.m., I was not in a dusty office above a dry cleaner. I was sitting in the oncology wing of the county hospital. It was the 2-year anniversary of my wife's passing, and I had spent the morning speaking with the nursing staff, who had cared for her in her final weeks, delivering the annual donation from Stevens Hardware in her memory. I had hospital security camera footage, a signed visitor log, and 20 nurses who could testify exactly where I was the moment Paul Griggs claimed I was sitting in front of him. The partnership agreement was a complete fabrication. But a fraudulent partnership is just the vehicle. I needed to see what they were actually driving away with. I minimized the state registry and logged directly into the store's primary operating account. If Emily was the new majority partner, she would not wait to start draining the equity. Trevor was a man drowning in debt. He needed liquid capital immediately to maintain his illusion of wealth. I opened the transaction ledger for the current quarter. The balance was significantly lower than it should have been. My eyes scanned the rows of outgoing payments, looking for the anomaly. It did not take long to find. 2 days ago, a wire transfer for $65,000 had been executed from the store's primary operating account. $65,000. That was nearly all of our liquid cash reserves, the money I kept on hand to ensure that if a supplier raised their prices or a roof collapsed, my employees would still get paid. I clicked on the transaction details. The money had been routed to an external corporate account under the classification of inventory modernization consulting fees. The recipient of the wire transfer was a company called Walsh Supply Consulting, LLC. I did not need to run a background check to know who owned that company. Trevor Walsh had not even bothered to disguise his own last name. He had simply set up a shell company, used his newly forged partnership agreement to authorize a consulting fee, and drained the lifeblood of my store directly into his own pocket. They had stolen my grandfather's history. They had forged my name. And they had taken the money my father had spent his entire life saving. But as I sat in the quiet office, digging through the digital debris of my sister's betrayal, I discovered something far more sickening than stolen money. I opened the store's primary email server. I have always maintained administrative access to all incoming and outgoing communications, a standard security protocol I implemented years ago to prevent vendor fraud. I ran a search for any emails sent from the store's domain that contained Trevor's or Emily's name. A single email populated on the screen. It was sent from an administrative alias, directly to Linda Cho at the bank, just a few hours before my loan signing appointment. I clicked open the email. The subject line read, "Urgent. Stevens Hardware Expansion Loan Review." I began to read the text. It was written by Emily. "Dear Linda, as the new majority partner of Stevens Hardware, I am writing to formally request a temporary suspension of the proposed $500,000 expansion loan. While I respect my brother Bradley deeply, his health is rapidly declining. He has struggled significantly since the passing of his wife, and his advancing diabetes is beginning to affect his cognitive reliability. He resists necessary modernization and simply cannot manage the stress of a massive store expansion alone. Trevor and I are stepping in to assume operational control to protect the family legacy before Bradley's condition jeopardizes the business entirely. We will be submitting a revised, downscaled business plan for your review shortly. Sincerely, Emily Stevens Walsh. I stopped breathing. The silence in the office was no longer heavy. It was deafening. I read the email again. His advancing diabetes is beginning to affect his cognitive reliability. This was not just a financial crime. This was a targeted character assassination. Emily knew perfectly well that my diabetes was entirely managed. She knew that my mind was sharper than it had ever been. She knew that the grief of losing my wife had not broken me, but had cemented my resolve to protect the store my wife had loved. But Emily was not writing the truth. She was writing a narrative. She was laying the groundwork for a medical conservatorship. She and Trevor were not just trying to steal 60% of the store. They were trying to establish a legally documented paper trail, proving that I was mentally unfit, emotionally unstable, and physically incapable of managing my own life. They were trying to strip me of my agency, reduce me to a helpless old man, and use my grief as a weapon to justify their theft. They wanted to sell the store, liquidate the assets, and walk away looking like the responsible family members who had stepped in to save a failing patriarch. People who betray you rarely write, "I am stealing." They write, "I had no choice," and they hope the paperwork forgives them. I slowly closed the laptop. The anger I felt was no longer hot. It was absolute freezing and entirely precise. Emily had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had attempted to erase my competence, my dignity, and my future. She had taken the red ledger, believing it gave her the power to rewrite the story of Stevens Hardware. She forgot that the red ledger had survived the Great Depression. It had survived the flood. It had survived the fire of 1989. It was not going to die because my sister married a man who knew how to use a copier. It was time to make a phone call. It was time to invite Emily and Trevor back into the store. It was time to build a stage for the final act of their corporate play. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. A gruff, tired voice answered on the second ring. "Yeah?" the voice said. "Ryan," I said softly. "It's Bradley." There was a pause on the line. Ryan Mercer was a retired federal investigator, a man who had spent 25 years dismantling organized financial crime before moving to the private sector. We had worked 3 major insurance fraud rings together in the late 90s. He was ruthless, methodical, and completely immune to emotional manipulation. "Bradley," Ryan said, his tone shifting instantly to professional alert. "It's been a while. What's wrong?" "I need you to pull a forensic audit on a shell company called Walsh Supply Consulting LLC, I told him, staring at the empty shadow on my wall where the business license used to hang. "I need bank routing numbers, IP login timestamps, and notary logs for Paul Griggs." "You working a new case?" Ryan asked. "I thought you retired to sell hammers." "I did," I replied. "But someone just tried to declare me medically incompetent and steal my grandfather's store." Ryan let out a low whistle. "A paper trail with relatives attached." "Those are the ugly ones." "Yes, they are," I said. "I need the entire evidence package finalized by Friday." "Friday?" Ryan asked. "What happens on Friday?" I looked at the empty space where the heavy iron safe used to sit. "I am hosting a founder's dinner," I said, "and I want to make sure the guests of honor get exactly what they deserve. There is a specific kind of silence that settles into a room when you realize the people you share a bloodline with have been actively planning your destruction. It is not the sudden, shocking silence of a car crash. It is the slow, suffocating silence of discovering a terminal diagnosis. For the next 3 days, I did not sleep. I did not open Stephen's Hardware for business. I taped a small, handwritten sign to the front door that simply read, "Closed for inventory restructuring." It was not a lie. I was restructuring everything. I spent 72 hours locked in the back office, working alongside Ryan Mercer. Ryan did not come to the store in a suit. He came wearing a faded fishing jacket, carrying a heavy encrypted laptop and a thermos of black coffee. He looked like an old man who had gotten lost on his way to the lake, which was exactly how he preferred to look when he was quietly dismantling someone's life. Ryan and I did not talk much. We didn't need to. We fell back into a rhythm we had perfected 20 years ago, while hunting down syndicate arsonists and corporate embezzlers. Every financial crime is built on a ladder of lies. To destroy the fraudster, you cannot just break the top rung. You have to break the entire ladder simultaneously so they have absolutely nowhere to fall but down. We started with the bank records. Ryan bypassed Trevor's shell company protections in less than 4 hours. Walsh Supply Consulting LLC was a masterpiece of amateur stupidity. Trevor had registered the LLC to a virtual P.O. box, but he had funded the initial setup fee using a personal credit card tied directly to his home address in the gated community. "He's arrogant," Ryan muttered, staring at his screen in the dim light of my office. "He didn't even try to layer the transaction. He just opened a bucket and dumped your $65,000 straight into it. He thinks he's stealing from an old man who doesn't understand the internet," I replied, staring at a printout of my forged signature. But the stolen cash was only the beginning. As Ryan dug deeper into Trevor's digital footprint, the true scope of the betrayal began to materialize. Trevor was not just stealing cash. He was preparing to sell the entire property. Ryan intercepted a series of unencrypted emails between Trevor and a commercial real estate developer based in Chicago. The developer had no interest in running a hardware store. He wanted the prime downtown real estate Stephen's Hardware sat on. He wanted to bulldoze my grandfather's legacy and turn it into a high-density, mixed-use condominium complex. Trevor had already negotiated a preliminary cash buyout, $850,000. The developer had even proposed keeping the old Stephen's Hardware sign in the condo lobby as heritage decor. They wanted to bulldoze my grandfather's store and hang its name over a mailroom. But Trevor had a massive legal problem. Even with Emily holding a fraudulent 60% majority stake, commercial real estate laws required a unanimous partner resolution to liquidate a foundational asset. As long as I held 40%, and as long as I was legally competent, I could block the sale indefinitely. That was why they needed the narrative. That was why they needed to declare me medically unfit. Ryan pulled up a draft document Trevor had saved in a shared cloud folder. It was a petition for emergency conservatorship. I read the document, feeling a cold, heavy knot tighten in my stomach. The petition heavily cited my type 2 diabetes, falsely claiming that I had suffered multiple hypoglycemic episodes that had resulted in severe cognitive decline. It claimed I was paranoid, hostile, and entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs. It painted Emily as a desperate, loving sister who was stepping in to save her brother from his own deteriorating mind. They were going to drag me into a courtroom. They were going to stand in front of a judge, weaponize my medical history, and strip me of my human agency. They were going to lock me in an assisted living facility while they bulldozed the store and split $850,000. And if that was not enough, Ryan found one final document. It was a draft for a commercial insurance claim. Trevor was planning to stage a massive inventory theft. The draft outlined a scenario where the rear warehouse of Stephen's Hardware would be broken into, resulting in the loss of nearly $200,000 worth of high-end power tools and generators. Trevor planned to file the claim, collect the insurance payout, and then immediately sell the empty building to the Chicago developer. He's trying to hit the trifecta: Ryan said quietly, taking a sip of his coffee. Embezzlement, real estate fraud, and insurance fraud. Your brother-in-law isn't just a thief, Bradley. He's a federal indictment waiting for a signature. I looked at the stack of printed evidence piling up on my father's old wooden desk. I had the video of them stealing the red ledger. I had the state registry timestamp proving the forgery. I had the notary logs from Paul Griggs proving I was at the hospital when the document was stamped. I had the wire transfers to the shell company. I had the conservatorship drafts, the real estate emails, and the fake insurance claim. But in fraud investigations, circumstantial evidence only gets you to a courtroom. If you want to absolutely bury a suspect, you need them to establish intent. You need them to admit, in their own words, that they know exactly what they are doing. Ryan tapped his keyboard. I managed to pull the metadata from a cloud backup of Emily's phone, he said. You might want to read these. He turned the laptop toward me. It was a text message thread between Emily and Trevor, dated 3 days before they broke into my safe. Trevor, we need to drain the cash reserves first. Transfer the $65K as soon as Griggs stamps the partnership agreement. We have to sell the building before Brad gets suspicious. Emily, I know, I hate doing this, Trevor. But he left me no choice. He won't let go of the past. I stared at the screen for a very long time. I hate doing this, but he left me no choice. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about my sister. She was not a victim of Trevor's manipulation. She was an active, willing participant who had manufactured a victim complex to justify her own greed. She truly believed that by pretending to feel guilty, she was absolving herself of the crime. She had reduced 3 generations of family history, my father's sweat and my wife's dying wish, to an inconvenience that was standing in the way of her condo buyout. Do we call the local police? Ryan asked, breaking the silence. This is enough to lock them both up for a decade. No, I said, slowly standing up from the desk. If we hand this to the police now, Trevor will hire an expensive defense attorney. He will claim the emails were hacked. He will claim the texts are out of context. He will drag this through the courts for 3 years. And Emily will spend every holiday crying to the family about how I am prosecuting my own sister over a misunderstanding. I walked over to the empty shadow on the wall. I do not want a trial, I said quietly. I want an execution. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Emily's number. I did not let the anger touch my voice. I did not let the cold, calculated fury bleed into my tone. I channeled every ounce of grief I had felt since my wife passed away. I slouched my shoulders, lowered my chin, and let my voice become weak, fragile, and utterly defeated. Emily answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? She said, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness. Bradley. Is everything okay, Emily? I said, letting a heavy, exhausted sigh escape my lips. I'm sorry to call you so late. Oh, it's fine, Brad. What's going on? You sound tired. I am tired, Em, I whispered, staring directly at the printed forgery on my desk. I'm so tired. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. I could almost hear her holding her breath on the other end of the line. I've been thinking about what you said last month, I continued, my voice breaking perfectly. About the store, about me trying to run it alone. You were right, Emily. I can't keep carrying this place. My health isn't what it used to be. My blood sugar has been spiking, and my memory, I just don't have the energy anymore. Oh, Bradley, Emily cooed, her voice practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. I'm so sorry to hear you say that. But you know Trevor and I are here for you. We just want what's best for you. We want to protect you. I know, I said weakly. That's why I want to talk about transferring control. Officially, I think it's time to bring you and Trevor in to manage the operations. There was a muffled sound on the other end of the line. I knew exactly what it was. It was Emily covering the microphone with her hand and frantically whispering to Trevor. Bradley, that is so brave of you to admit, Emily said, coming back on the line, her tone completely shifting into business mode. Trevor and I would be honored to step in. We can start reviewing the corporate structure immediately. I want to do this, Riti, I said. I want to honor Grandpa's legacy. I am hosting a founder's dinner at the store this Friday night, after closing. Just family, and a few of the people who have kept this place alive. I want to announce the transition there. That sounds beautiful, Brad, she said eagerly. Bring Trevor, I added. And Emily? Yes? Tell Trevor to bring the new partnership documents, the ones he's been working on. I want to sign everything in front of the staff. I want this to be clean. I heard Trevor's voice in the background, sharp and greedy. Tell him yes. Tell him we'll have the originals. We will absolutely be there, Bradley, Emily promised. We'll bring everything. It's going to be a clean break, I promise. I hung up the phone and looked across the desk at Ryan Mercer. Ryan was smiling. It was a cold, terrifying smile. Clean, I whispered, dropping my phone onto the desk. Clean is exactly what I had in mind. The founders' dinner was a tradition my grandfather had started in the winter of 1948. Back then, it was just him, 2 part-time employees, and a few local tradesmen eating cold sandwiches in the back office, celebrating the fact that the store had survived another year. Over the decades, my father had expanded the tradition, inviting the people who made the business possible: suppliers, local business owners, the accountants, and the floor staff who kept the shelves stocked. It was always a night of absolute gratitude. When I set up the long folding tables down the center of aisle 3 on Friday evening, I was not preparing for gratitude. I was preparing a courtroom. I arranged the seating with the same precise, cold logic I used when arranging an interrogation room. I placed Emily and Trevor at the head of the table, directly beneath the large, framed black and white photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the original storefront. Right behind their chairs was the thick glass display case, where the red ledger was supposed to sit. It was currently empty, a glaring, hollow gap in the history of the room. The guest list was carefully curated. Linda Cho, the commercial banker, was sitting halfway down the table, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Michelle, the bakery owner who had made the initial phone call, sat across from her. Carl, my loyal store manager who had worked these floors for 22 years, was seated near the front. I had also invited 3 of our primary inventory suppliers, my personal corporate attorney, and 2 retired employees who had known my father well. And sitting at the very end of the table, wearing a wrinkled sport coat and nursing a glass of sparkling water, was Ryan Mercer. The final guest to arrive was Paul Griggs. The crooked notary walked through the front doors of the hardware store, looking incredibly nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected a trap. I greeted him warmly, shook his hand, and guided him to a chair directly across from my attorney. By 8 o'clock, the store was bathed in the warm yellow glow of the overhead pendant lights. The smell of catered roasted chicken and the familiar scent of sawdust filled the air. Emily and Trevor were absolutely glowing. Trevor was wearing a dark blue, tailored Italian suit that cost more than the average cash register pull on a busy Saturday. He was holding a glass of wine, leaning back in his chair and projecting the easy, relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen an empire. Emily was wearing a subtle, elegant black dress, playing the role of the devoted, deeply concerned younger sister to perfection. She kept placing her hand over mine, offering the other guests sad, sympathetic smiles whenever I coughed or looked down at my plate. As the dinner plates were being cleared away, Trevor decided it was time to take the stage. He tapped his wine glass with a silver fork. The sharp, clear ringing sound echoed down aisle 3, bouncing off the shelves of galvanized steel and heavy power tools. The conversations around the table slowly died down. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trevor said, standing up and smoothing the front of his expensive suit jacket. "When Bradley told us he wanted to host a founders' dinner this year, Emily and I knew we had to be here." He paused, looking down at me with a perfectly practiced expression of pity. As many of you know, this has been a difficult few years for Bradley, Trevor continued, his voice smooth and incredibly persuasive. Since losing his wife, he has poured his heart into this store. But legacy means knowing when to hand control to people who understand growth. It means recognizing when the physical and mental toll has become too much to bear. Emily wiped a completely dry eye with a white napkin. Bradley, nobody wants to take this from you, she whispered loud enough for the entire table to hear. We just want to save it from you. We want to carry the burden so you can finally rest. Trevor smiled, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. And that is why, tonight, we are officially announcing a transition of leadership. We have the final restructuring documents here, ready for Bradley's signature. He pulled a thick, stapled legal document from his jacket and placed it on the table in front of me. The fraudulent partnership agreement, the one that was supposed to make it all look completely voluntary. The room was completely silent. Linda Cho was staring at the table, her face pale. Carl, my store manager, looked like he was about to stand up and throw Trevor through the front window. I looked at the document. Then I looked up at Trevor. Finish the story, Trevor, I said quietly, leaning back in my chair. Trevor frowned, his perfect smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Excuse me? I always learn more when thieves feel safe, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet hardware store. Go ahead. Tell them how you plan to save my grandfather's legacy by bulldozing it into a condominium complex. The color instantly drained from Trevor's face. Emily's hand jerked away from mine as if she had just touched a hot stove. Bradley, what are you talking about? Emily stammered, looking nervously at the guests. Are you having another episode? Your blood sugar must be. I did not let her finish the sentence. I reached under the table and pressed a button on a small remote control, a massive projector screen, which I had hung from the ceiling beams earlier that afternoon, suddenly rolled down directly behind Emily and Trevor, covering the photograph of my grandfather. The projector clicked on. The first image to fill the screen was the high-definition, cloud-recorded security footage of Trevor and Emily standing in my back office, opening the safe and stealing the red ledger. Michelle gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. Carl stood up from his chair. Emily, this is a family business, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. But you are not acting like family. You are acting like a parasite. Trevor's corporate polish completely evaporated. He slammed his hands on the table. Turn that off, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are completely delusional, Bradley. You signed a partnership agreement, giving Emily 60% controlling interest. It is legally binding. I pressed the button again. The screen changed. It displayed a massive, side-by-side forensic analysis of the signature on the fraudulent partnership agreement next to my actual signature from a bank document. You forged my name, Trevor, I said, looking directly into his panicked eyes. But you don't know how to forge speed. You hesitated on the bottom loop of the Y. It is the classic micro-hesitation of an amateur drawing a signature instead of writing it. That proves nothing, Trevor yelled, his voice cracking. The document was notarized. It is a certified legal instrument. I turned my head and looked directly at Paul Griggs. The notary was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. I pressed the remote again. The screen shifted to a digital timestamp of the notary seal, reading Tuesday at 10:15 a.m. Below it was a certified letter from the county hospital's oncology ward, accompanied by hospital security camera footage, showing me sitting in the cancer ward at the exact minute Paul Griggs claimed I was in his office. Paul Griggs, I said softly. Did I sign that document in front of you? Paul Griggs swallowed hard. He looked at Trevor. He looked at the federal investigator sitting at the end of the table. And then, the crooked notary completely shattered. Trevor told me it was just family paperwork. Paul stammered, holding his hands up defensively. He said you were too sick to come in. He gave me $300 to stamp it. I didn't know he was stealing the business. Fraud always sounds smaller when people want the fee, I replied coldly, dismissing him. Emily stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Bradley, stop this right now, she screamed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure desperation. This is family business. You don't humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of strangers. No, Emily, I corrected her. Family business is what Grandpa built. This is fraud with a shared last name. Trevor was hyperventilating now. He grabbed the document off the table and tried to shove it back into his jacket. You can't prove intent, he yelled desperately. You can't prove we were going to sell. Ryan Mercer, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, finally stood up. He buttoned his faded fishing jacket and looked at Trevor with absolute, predatory calm. Ryan said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet store. That is exactly what the text messages are for. I pressed the remote one last time. The screen filled with the intercepted text messages between Trevor and Emily. The words glowed brightly in the dim light of ASIL 3. Drain the cash reserves first. Transfer the $65K as soon as Griggs stamps the agreement. We have to sell the building before Brad gets suspicious. I hate doing this, Trevor, but he left me no choice. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total destruction. The illusion Emily had spent months building, the narrative of the loving sister saving her sick brother, was completely vaporized in 10 seconds of digital text. Linda Cho, the commercial banker, stood up from the table. She looked at Emily with absolute disgust. She picked up her briefcase and snapped it shut. This loan application is permanently suspended, Linda said, her voice hard and professional. And as an officer of a federally insured bank, I am legally obligated to file an immediate fraud referral regarding the forged corporate restructuring documents you submitted this morning. Trevor stumbled backward, bumping hard into the empty glass display case. We can explain this, Trevor begged, looking frantically around the room at the suppliers and the employees. We were just trying to modernize. We were trying to save the equity. You were trying to file a fraudulent commercial insurance claim for $200,000 in staged warehouse theft. Ryan Mercer interrupted smoothly, pulling a federal badge from his pocket and placing it on the table. And you were trying to use a fraudulent medical narrative to force a competent man into a conservatorship so you could bulldoze his grandfather's legacy for a condo payout. The heavy glass front doors of Stevens Hardware suddenly chimed, signaling someone entering the building. 4 officers from the State Financial Crimes Task Force walked into the store, accompanied by 2 uniformed county deputies. They did not come with sirens blaring. They did not need to. They walked down the aisle with quiet, absolute authority. By the time dessert was served, I said quietly, looking at Trevor, the people waiting outside were not there because I was angry. They were there because the bank, the insurer, and the state fraud unit had all seen the same evidence. A deputy stepped forward and placed his hand heavily on Trevor's shoulder. Mr. Walsh, the deputy said grimly, you need to come with us. Emily watched in horror as a state investigator read Trevor his rights and pulled his arms behind his back, securing them with steel handcuffs. Her expensive black dress suddenly looked completely ridiculous in the harsh reality of a criminal arrest. She turned to look at me. The fake sympathy was gone. The sisterly concern was gone. There was nothing left but raw, toxic entitlement. Dad would have wanted the store to survive, Emily screamed, tears of genuine rage finally spilling down her face. Bradley was killing it. You called the police on your own sister. I looked at the woman I had grown up with. I looked at the woman who had watched our father work his fingers to the bone, who had watched my wife organize the bookkeeping while fighting cancer, and who had decided that all of that history was worth exactly $850,000. Dad wanted it to survive as a store, Emily, I said softly. Not as a lobby theme for condos. You didn't want the store. You wanted the right to sell the story. And I called the truth on a thief who knew my mother's maiden name. The deputies escorted Trevor and Emily out of the front doors. The red and blue lights from the cruisers outside flashed through the front windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the shelves of Stephen's hardware. I reached under the table, turned off the projector, and finally sat down to eat my dinner. 18 months later, after endless plea negotiations, grueling forensic accounting, and one incredibly short criminal trial that neither of them could afford to finish, the legal system finally provided an ending to the story my sister tried to write. Justice in financial crimes is rarely swift, but when it arrives backed by a 30-year veteran of fraud investigations and a retired federal agent, it is absolutely devastating. Trevor Walsh was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The sheer volume of his hubris was his undoing, because he had attempted to defraud a federally insured bank, routed stolen funds across state lines through his shell company, and drafted documents to commit commercial insurance fraud. The charges were elevated far beyond a simple domestic dispute. He lost his expensive suits, his gated community home, and his carefully constructed corporate vocabulary. Emily fought harder. She hired an expensive defense attorney using the last of their credit and attempted to play the victim card one final time. Her lawyer argued that she was a naive, emotionally distraught woman who had simply trusted her husband's financial advice. But then the prosecution played the unencrypted text messages. "I hate doing this, Trevor. But he left me no choice. You cannot claim ignorance when you are actively acknowledging the cruelty of your own actions." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Emily Stevens was sentenced to 4 years in a state correctional facility. I did not attend her sentencing hearing. I did not want to see her wearing a prison uniform, and I did not want her to have the satisfaction of thinking I was there to gloat. The woman who had complained that my hardware store smelled like sawdust and old men was now going to spend the next 4 years sleeping in a concrete box that smelled of bleach and regret. The recovery process for Stephen's hardware took time, but we survived it the same way my grandfather survived the Great Depression, by putting our heads down and doing the work. The fraudulent amendment to our corporate structure was formally voided by the state registry. My $65,000 had been heavily depleted by Trevor's legal retail fees before his accounts were frozen. But thanks to Ryan Mercer's aggressive asset tracking, we managed to recover just over $40,000 of it. The commercial insurance claim was permanently withdrawn, and Linda Cho personally fast-tracked our original $500,000 expansion loan, ensuring we received the lowest possible interest rate as a quiet apology from the bank. We used the loan to expand the physical footprint of the store, doubling our inventory capacity and hiring 3 new full-time floor staff. We also completely overhauled our internal security protocols. The old steel safe in the back office was replaced by a modern biometric vault. The cloud cameras were upgraded, and Carl, my loyal floor manager, was officially promoted to junior partner. Receiving a 10% equity stake in the business he had spent 2 decades helping to build. And in the center of the store, sitting proudly in a freshly polished, reinforced glass display case, was the red ledger. It had been returned to me by the county evidence locker a week after Emily's conviction. The thick, leather-bound book looked exactly the same. It still held the faded ink of the farmers who owed us money in 1934. It still held the sharp, slanted handwriting of my father. It remained the physical embodiment of every promise this family had ever kept. On the first page after my father's note, I wrote one new line in black ink. Carl Whitaker, junior partner, 10% equity, earned over 22 years of showing up. 2 months after the trial ended, I started something new. On the first Tuesday evening of every month, long after the store has closed, I unlock the front doors and host a free 2-hour workshop for local small business owners. I stand at the front of Aisle 3, right where Trevor's corporate play had fallen apart, and I teach them the brutal realities of commercial ownership. I teach them how to identify micro-hesitations in a forged signature. I teach them how to run forensic audits on their own bank accounts. I teach them why a digital paper trail is infinitely more valuable than a verbal promise. I call the workshop, How to Protect Your Business from the People Who Know Where You Keep the Spare Key. Because the hardest lesson I ever learned as an investigator was not how to catch a thief. It was learning that the most dangerous thieves do not wear ski masks. They wear tailored suits. They smile at family dinners. They use your grief as leverage, and they weaponize your trust to quietly rewrite the history you spent your entire life building. I am 59 years old now. My blood sugar is perfectly managed. My mind is as sharp as a newly ground chisel, and I still walk the floors of Stevens Hardware every single morning. I unlock the front door at 6 in the morning, long before the sun comes up over Grand Island. I walk into the quiet, dimly lit building, and I breathe in the familiar scent of cut wood, machine oil, and cold steel. It is a smell that means survival. It is a smell that means legacy. My sister tried to take this place from me because she thought she was entitled to the history. She thought that because we shared a last name, she automatically deserved to own the narrative. But blood is just biology. Blood may tell you who belongs at the table in a family photograph, but evidence tells you who should never, ever be allowed near the cash register again. If you were Bradley, would you have handled Emily privately because she was his sister and kept the police out of it? Or did she completely lose the right to be treated like family the moment she tried to declare him medically unfit and sell their grandfather's store? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.